There comes a moment in life when you realize that everything you believed to be true was a carefully constructed lie, and that moment usually arrives when it's already too late to change anything. Mauricio Souza was living that moment now, watching his 8-year-old daughter waste away day after day in a private hospital bed inside his own mansion, surrounded by the most expensive medical equipment in the world, machines that beeped and monitored endlessly but could do absolutely nothing to stop her body from fading like a candle slowly melting away. The best doctors in the country had examined Anna, had run every test imaginable, and the answer was always the same and equally terrifying: we don't know what's happening. Meanwhile, the little girl who had been running and jumping through the house just months earlier could now barely lift her head from the pillow, the paralysis creeping up her body with a methodical cruelty that made Mauricio wake up in the middle of the night choking on panic. He was a billionaire, he could buy almost anything in this world, but he couldn't buy the one thing that truly mattered: his daughter's life. And worst of all, he had no idea that the answer to the mystery was much closer than he imagined, hidden inside his own home, being administered every single day by hands he trusted blindly. That particular night, Mauricio had gone out to dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, a last desperate attempt to pretend everything was normal before completely losing his mind. Le Bernardin was the kind of place where each dish cost more than a family's monthly salary, where Austrian crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling and the elite gathered to strike million-dollar deals between bites of food that was more art than nourishment. But the illusion of normalcy lasted exactly until the moment a street boy walked into the main dining room, his bare feet leaving trails of dirt on a 300,000 real Persian rug, his too thin body wrapped in rags that had once been clothes, and his eyes far too large for that small face, shining with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. The contrast was so violent that several people froze midair with silverware still in hand, silence swallowing the room as if someone had pressed a pause button on reality itself. And then that boy, that impossible intruder in a sanctuary of privilege, walked straight up to Mauricio's table and said something so absurd it should have been laughed at: "Feed me and I'll cure your daughter." 7 simple words that made no sense at all, 7 words any rational person should have ignored, 7 words that changed absolutely everything. The boy's name was Dean, and he carried knowledge that doctors trained at the world's finest universities didn't even know existed. Knowledge about plants that heal and plants that kill, about poisons that don't show up on toxicology tests, about how the human body reacts to substances modern science has forgotten or never discovered in the first place. He had learned all of it from his grandmother, a healer who safeguarded ancestral wisdom passed down through generations, and now that orphaned boy living on the streets was about to do something that went far beyond simply curing a sick child. He was going to expose a conspiracy so twisted, so full of betrayal and calculated cruelty, that when the truth finally came to light, Mauricio would wonder if he had ever truly known the people around him. Because what was killing Anna wasn't a mysterious, incurable disease as everyone believed. It was something far simpler and infinitely more horrifying. Someone was deliberately poisoning her day after day, meal after meal, using a plant that very few people in the world even knew existed and fewer still knew how to use. And the person behind it? Well, that revelation would make everything that came before seem like child's play. But wait, because it gets even more impossible to believe. While Mauricio fought to save the girl he had always called his daughter, whom he had raised from birth and loved more than his own life, a bombshell truth was about to explode. Anna was not biologically his daughter. She never had been. And the street boy who appeared out of nowhere to save her? He was the one who actually carried Mauricio's blood in his veins, his nephew, the son of a brother who had died years earlier, leaving buried secrets now being unearthed in the worst possible way. The web of lies, betrayals, and impossible twists that was about to unfold was so complex that just when you think you understand everything, just when you believe you've seen the worst of it, you'll discover there was an even more disturbing layer waiting underneath. And the person who orchestrated all of this, who wove this web of horror with the patience of a spider waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was someone who slept every night under the same roof as Anna, someone Mauricio paid generously to protect his daughter, someone he trusted completely and without question. But none of that you can imagine yet, because the story is far darker than it seems at first glance. So if you want to know how a 12-year-old boy managed to do what entire medical teams failed to do, if you want to discover who was poisoning Anna and why someone would do something so monstrous to an innocent child, if you want to witness the moment when all the masks fall and the most painful truths explode inside an abandoned warehouse with guns drawn and revelations that shatter everything you thought you knew about family and loyalty, then you need to stay until the end of this video. Because I promise that every minute will reveal something you didn't see coming, every twist will be more impossible than the last, and when we reach the final part, you'll understand why this story is about much more than a child being healed. It's about how evil can hide behind the most convincing masks, how ancient knowledge can sometimes be more powerful than modern technology, and how sometimes true family isn't the one that shares your blood, but the one that chooses to stand by you when everything is falling apart. And before we continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the next videos bringing stories as impossible as this one, stories that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature, about justice, and about how far people are willing to go when driven by revenge, greed, or the desperate need to save the ones they love. Now come with me because the story is just beginning, and believe me, you can't even imagine where this is going. Mauricio Souza had everything money could buy, but none of it mattered anymore. He had built an empire from nothing, raised skyscrapers, closed multimillion-dollar deals, and dominated entire markets with the cold, calculating mindset that turned him into a legend in business. People trembled when he entered a room, not out of fear of violence, but under the weight of someone who simply did not accept no as an answer. Mauricio was the kind of man who solved problems with a phone call, who turned obstacles into opportunities, who never, ever bowed to anything or anyone. But now, for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. His tired eyes watched his daughter Anna lying in that massive bed, surrounded by extremely expensive machines that beeped and monitored every beat of her heart. The girl who once ran through the mansion, filling the house with laughter and chaos, could now barely lift her head from the pillow. It all began with something that seemed simple, almost insignificant. Anna complained of a tingling sensation in her hands during breakfast, a strange feeling she described as if thousands of invisible ants were crawling under her skin. Mauricio didn't think much of it at the time. Children always have strange things like that, silly fears that disappear with time. But the tingling did not disappear. On the contrary, it spread up her arms, down her legs, taking over the girl's entire body like a silent plague. Within days, Anna lost strength in her fingers and could no longer hold a glass of juice. Her motor coordination began to fail in a terrifying way. She tripped on flat surfaces, dropped objects unintentionally, and her movements became slow and uncoordinated, like a doll whose joints were slowly rusting. Mauricio wasted no time. He called in the best doctors in the country, renowned specialists who charged fortunes just for the initial consultation. The mansion turned into a private hospital, with nurses on duty 24 hours a day, state-of-the-art equipment installed in Anna's bedroom, and an entire medical team dedicated exclusively to her case. They ran blood tests, MRIs, CT scans, genetic tests, neurological analyses, muscle evaluations, investigating every possibility from autoimmune diseases to extremely rare neurological disorders. The results always came back the same, frustrating and empty. Everything normal. Nothing detected. No plausible explanation. It was as if Anna's body was shutting down by its own will, without cause, without reason, without a visible culprit that medicine could identify and fight. Mauricio spent the equivalent of a luxury home on tests alone, but the money that had always bought him everything now could not buy the one thing that truly mattered: answers. The paralysis advanced with methodical, relentless cruelty. Week after week, Anna lost another piece of herself, another movement that would never return. First her toes, then her ankles stopped responding to her brain's commands. Soon her entire legs became dead weight she had to drag with enormous effort. Her arms followed the same dark path. Her shoulders stiffened, her neck began to ache and harden, until turning her head became almost impossible. The girl who loved to dance, who was always jumping and running through the house, was now trapped inside her own body like an invisible, silent prison. Mauricio watched it all happen and felt something he had never felt before in his life. A deep, visceral fear that grew in his chest like a black hole, swallowing every trace of hope. He was used to controlling, dominating, winning. Against this he had no weapon at all. Nights became endless for Mauricio. He stayed awake until dawn, sitting in an armchair beside Anna's bed, watching her breathing rise and fall with increasing difficulty. The hardened businessman who never showed weakness now had constantly red, sunken eyes, an unshaven beard, wrinkled clothes worn by someone who no longer cared about appearances. He watched his daughter fade day after day, and every morning brought a subtle but undeniable decline, another lost movement, another limitation settling in without warning. Anna tried to smile at him, tried to pretend everything was fine, but Mauricio saw the terror in her eyes, the fear of a child who feels her own body slowly shutting down and doesn't understand why. That terror reflected in his daughter's eyes was worse than any nightmare, worse than any financial collapse or business defeat could ever be. The doctors began whispering among themselves, those low, evasive conversations that happen when professionals no longer have answers. They spoke of rare cases, atypical situations, uncatalogued possibilities, but deep down Mauricio could translate all that medical jargon. They had no idea what was happening. Some suggested experimental treatments, unproven therapies that might or might not work, drugs still in testing phases with brutal side effects. Mauricio authorized everything. He accepted any attempt, no matter how desperate, because standing still and watching his daughter slowly die was a torture he simply could not endure. But nothing worked. Absolutely nothing made the slightest difference. Anna continued to worsen, her body continued to shut down, and time was running out at a terrifying speed. The mansion, once a symbol of conquest and power, now felt like a mausoleum filled with heavy silences and looks of pity. The staff walked on tiptoe, whispered among themselves, avoided eye contact when they crossed paths with Mauricio in the endless corridors. Everyone knew something terrible was happening, but no one had the courage to speak of it openly. The atmosphere was dense, suffocating, as if the entire house were holding its breath, waiting for an outcome everyone feared but no one wanted to name. Mauricio felt the weight of those looks, that silent compassion that was almost unbearable for a man accustomed to being feared and respected, never pitied. He was alone in this battle, completely alone, even surrounded by people on all sides. And the worst of it all was the absolute helplessness. Mauricio had the power to move mountains, the influence to open doors closed to anyone else, enough money to buy almost anything in this world. But none of it mattered now. None of it saved Anna. None of it stopped her body from continuing to shut down like a candle slowly melting away. He had offered fortunes to anyone who could bring a solution. He had threatened, begged, negotiated. But the illness, or whatever was killing his daughter, did not care about money or power or connections. Mauricio Souza, the man who always had all the answers, now had none. And with each passing day, each ticking hour on the clock, there was less of Anna left to save. The situation was reaching a critical point that everyone felt but no one dared to mention. Doctors began talking about palliative care, in that careful, professional tone that barely concealed the real meaning. They were giving up. Mauricio threw them all out, screamed, broke things, but deep down he knew the anger was only a release valve for the despair consuming him from the inside. Anna was dying. That was the brutal, inescapable fact. Her body was shutting down system by system, and no one could explain why or stop it from happening. Mauricio, the emperor of his business empire, was about to lose the only thing that truly mattered. And it was exactly in that moment of total darkness, when all hope seemed completely exhausted, that something absolutely unexpected was about to happen. Dinner that night would be at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, a last desperate effort by Mauricio to pretend normalcy, to escape the mansion that had become a prison of anguish. He had no idea that that five-star restaurant, that ultimate symbol of luxury and exclusivity, would become the stage for the most unlikely encounter of his life. An encounter that would begin with absurdity, be seasoned with public humiliation, but that perhaps, just perhaps, would be the only real chance to save Anna. Because sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, in the most unlikely forms, and carries a price far greater than the money Mauricio was used to paying for everything. Le Bernardin was more than a restaurant. It was a temple of the elite, a sanctuary where only the chosen were allowed to enter. Massive mahogany doors opened into a dining room decorated with Austrian crystal chandeliers that cost more than imported cars, tables covered with hand-embroidered Italian linen cloths, and genuine silver cutlery reflecting the ambient light and creating tiny constellations across immaculate surfaces. Every detail screamed exclusivity, from the Persian carpet that muffled footsteps to the French sommelier who spoke 5 languages and knew wine vintages most people had never even heard of. The waiters moved like dancers, with precise, silent gestures, serving dishes that were true works of art, where rare ingredients blended into harmonies costing hundreds of dollars per portion. The air conditioning kept the temperature perfect, neither hot nor cold, just comfortable, and the background sound was classical music played so softly it felt like a whisper, designed not to disturb the important conversations taking place there. Mauricio had chosen that place because he needed to breathe, needed to escape the suffocating mansion where every room reminded him of Anna's illness and the helplessness consuming him. He sat at a corner table from where he could observe the entire room without being observed too much, and ordered an aged whiskey that cost more than many people's monthly salary. The amber liquid burned its way down his throat, but the burn was welcome, because at least it was a sensation different from the constant anguish tightening his chest. Around him, businessmen discussed multimillion-dollar mergers, politicians made discreet deals, wealthy couples celebrated anniversaries with champagne bottles worth small fortunes. Everyone wore designer clothes, Swiss watches, jewelry glittering under the calculated light of the chandeliers. It was a world apart, a bubble of privilege where ordinary human problems simply did not exist, where everything was perfect, controlled, predictable. It was exactly in this scene of absolute perfection that Dean appeared. No one saw where he came from. It was as if he materialized out of nowhere in the middle of the main dining room. A boy of about 12, maybe 13, impossible to know his exact age because dirt covered much of his face. His clothes were a collection of patched rags, a t-shirt that had once been white but now carried the undefined color of something worn for months without washing, torn shorts at the knees and hem, all far too big for his thin body that looked like it hadn't eaten properly in weeks. His feet were bare, filthy with dark soil that left marks on the Persian carpet with every step. His hair was a mess of tangled strands, long and unkempt, and his eyes were far too large for that small face, eyes that shone with a strange, almost disturbing intensity. The smell coming from him was unmistakable. Old sweat, dirt, street dust, that characteristic odor of someone who lives outdoors and has nowhere to bathe. The effect was instant and devastating. Conversation stopped as if someone had pressed a pause button. Cutlery froze in midair between plates and mouths. Wine glasses remained motionless in the hands of patrons who had completely forgotten what they were doing. Everyone stared at Dean with a mixture of shock, disgust, and absolute indignation. It was as if an alien had just landed in the middle of that sanctuary of luxury, his presence there so absurd and impossible. The contrast was violent, almost offensive to eyes accustomed to perfection. That dirty, hungry body walking among expensive crystals and fine porcelain plates. Living misery invading the territory of ultimate privilege. Everything those people paid fortunes to never have to see or think about in their daily lives. The silence that took over the room was dense and heavy, loaded with a tension that grew by the second. Dean did not seem intimidated in the slightest. He walked slowly through the dining room, looking around with those large, intense eyes, as if searching for something or someone specific. His bare feet left trails of dirt on the immaculate carpet, each footprint a visual affront that made customers shrink back in disgust. His nostrils flared, clearly taking in the aromas coming from the kitchens, the wonderful smells of grilled meats, refined sauces, fresh bread coming out of the oven. Hunger was visible in his posture, in the way his eyes fixed on tables full of food, in how he swallowed hard every time he passed near a steaming dish. But there was something else in that gaze, something beyond simple physical hunger. There was determination, a sense of purpose that kept him walking despite all the hostile stares pinned on him. He was not there just to ask for food. Anyone could see that. He was looking for something or someone. The maitre d' reacted with the speed of a soldier trained for crisis situations. Jacques, a Frenchman in his early 50s who had run that establishment with an iron hand for over 2 decades, rushed toward Dean with his face red with indignation. He gestured frantically, pointed toward the door, spoke in a mix of French and Portuguese about trespassing, about standards of conduct, about the restaurant's reputation. His voice, normally controlled and smooth, now came out shrill and loud, completely shattering the carefully cultivated atmosphere of calm he worked so hard to maintain. 2 security guards emerged from the shadows, large men in black suits with earpieces, advancing on the boy with the intimidating posture that usually sufficed to resolve any problem. The other diners watched the scene with a mix of morbid fascination and relief, glad that someone was taking action to remove that unacceptable stain from their perfect setting. But Dean did not run, did not cower, showed no fear at all. He simply stopped walking, stood there in the middle of the dining room, and his eyes scanned the tables one by one until they finally landed on Mauricio. It was as if he knew exactly who he was looking for, as if he had come there with a specific purpose and had just found it. Their gaze locked for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Dean staring at Mauricio with that unsettling intensity, and Mauricio feeling something strange twist in his stomach, a sensation he could not name. It was almost like recognition, but that made no sense, because Mauricio was absolutely certain he had never seen that boy before in his life. Before the guards could get close enough to grab him, Dean took 2 steps toward Mauricio's table, opened his mouth, and said something that made the entire restaurant freeze completely. The words that came out of that dirty mouth echoed through the room like a cannon blast shattering glass. They were not words begging for food. They were not a humble request for help. They were nothing anyone there expected to hear. What Dean said was so absurd, so impossible, so completely insane that some people thought they had misheard, while others simply could not process the meaning right away. Mauricio felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet, as if reality had jolted and stopped making sense. Those simple words carried a promise so impossible it bordered on offense, yet at the same time struck the only vulnerable point Mauricio had in the entire world. And strangest of all was the absolute certainty with which Dean spoke. There was no doubt in that voice, no hesitation. It was a statement delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was saying. The guards hesitated, looking at Mauricio, waiting for an order. Jacques stood there with his mouth open, completely lost about how to proceed in the face of that surreal situation. The other diners began whispering among themselves, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads in disbelief, all fascinated by the unexpected drama exploding in the middle of their refined dinner. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Everyone waited to see what Mauricio would do, how the powerful businessman would react to that absurd intrusion and that impossible proposal. Luxury and misery stood face to face, separated by only a few meters of Persian carpet stained with dirty footprints, and in that moment it felt as though the entire world was suspended, waiting to see what would happen next. Because what Dean had just said was not something that could be easily ignored, no matter how absurd it seemed at first glance. Mauricio looked at that dirty, hungry boy, at those eyes far too large and shining with impossible certainty, and felt something stir inside him. Hope mixed with anger, curiosity mixed with disbelief, desperation mixed with a wild urge to believe in the impossible. Because when you are drowning, when you have nothing left to lose, when all doors have already closed and darkness is about to swallow everything you love, even the most absurd proposal begins to seem worthy of consideration. And God help him, what Dean had just promised was so absurd, so completely insane, that Mauricio knew he should order the guards to throw that boy out immediately. But he couldn't. He simply couldn't give the order. Because something in that moment, something in those eyes, something in that voice filled with certainty, stopped him from closing that last door that had just opened in such an unexpected and surreal way. The words were still echoing in the air when Dean repeated them, louder this time, leaving no doubt about what he was proposing. "Feed me and I'll cure your daughter." The sentence was simple, direct, impossible to interpret in any other way, and carried an audacity so absurd it bordered on insanity. Mauricio felt the blood rush to his face, an explosive mix of anger and disbelief taking over him. Who did that street kid think he was, walking into a place like that and making such a ridiculous promise? How did he know about Anna? How did he have the nerve to use the suffering of a sick child as a bargaining chip for a plate of food? Mauricio's first reaction was to stand up so abruptly that his chair nearly tipped backward, his fists slamming onto the table and making the silver cutlery clink against the fine porcelain. His face was red, the veins in his neck bulging, and everyone in the restaurant could see that an explosion was about to happen. But before Mauricio could shout or order the boy thrown out, something extraordinary happened. His phone, which had been silenced on the table, began vibrating frantically. It was Nurse Raquel calling from the mansion, and she never called during dinner unless it was urgent, something too important to wait. Mauricio answered with a trembling hand, bracing himself to hear the worst possible news, the one he had been fearing for weeks. But Raquel's voice on the other end was confused, almost frightened, describing something she herself seemed unable to fully believe. Anna had just shown a reaction that hadn't happened in months. She had moved. She had turned her head on her own. She had spoken her father's name with a clarity that hadn't existed since the paralysis began. And the strangest part of all, the most impossible to explain, was that it had happened at the exact moment Dean spoke those words in the restaurant, as if there were some invisible connection between them. Mauricio ended the call in absolute shock, staring at Dean with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to terror. How was that possible? How could a street kid know about Anna, about her condition, and even more impossible, how could his mere presence or his words have caused a reaction in her from miles away? It made no sense. It defied all logic, all reason, every possible scientific explanation. But Mauricio had heard Raquel's voice, had sensed her genuine surprise, and knew her well enough to know she wouldn't make something like that up. Something had happened to Anna at that exact moment. That was undeniable. And no matter how absurd the coincidence was, it existed. The rational businessman, the man who had always trusted data and hard facts, suddenly found himself facing something he simply could not explain with the logic he had used to govern his entire life. The dining room erupted into murmurs and nervous laughter. Guests began commenting among themselves about the ridiculous scene unfolding, about that dirty boy daring to promise miraculous cures in exchange for food. Some found it amusing, others shook their heads with pity or disgust, and a few even discreetly pulled out their phones to film the bizarre moment that would surely become a story to tell later. A woman in a gala dress whispered loudly enough to be heard that this was typical of those street scammers who take advantage of other people's desperation. A man in an outrageously expensive Italian suit commented to his companion that this kind of charlatanism should be a crime, and that the boy needed a lesson in respect. Jacques, the maitre d', was mortified watching the impeccable reputation of his restaurant being stained by that circus-like scene, and made increasingly frantic gestures for the security guards to act quickly and remove the source of embarrassment. But Mauricio raised his hand in a gesture that froze everyone in place. His voice came out low, controlled, dangerous. "Wait." The guard stopped immediately, recognizing the tone of someone who wasn't asking but commanding. Jacques opened his mouth to protest but closed it again when he saw the expression on Mauricio's face, that mix of contained fury and something else, something that almost looked like desperate hope. Silence fell over the dining room again, but now it was different, charged with morbid expectation. Everyone wanted to see what the powerful Mauricio Souza would do in the face of that impossible situation, whether he would simply have the boy dragged out or do something completely unexpected. The tension was palpable. You could feel it in people's held breaths, in the way everyone subtly leaned forward, unwilling to miss a single detail of what was about to happen. Dean did not move. He showed neither fear nor triumph. He simply stood there, looking at Mauricio with those large, intense eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. There was a strange wisdom in that young face covered in dirt, an absolute certainty that didn't match his age or the situation he was in. He didn't look like a scammer trying to fool someone, didn't have the nervous patter of someone improvising a lie. It was the opposite. A deep, almost unsettling calm, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had no doubt about the outcome. Mauricio noticed it. He realized there was no falsehood in that gaze, and that disturbed him even more because it meant the boy truly believed what he was saying. Whether through insanity, delusion, or some impossible truth, Dean genuinely believed he could cure Anna. And that unshakable certainty was more convincing than any logical argument could ever be. Mauricio took 2 steps toward Dean, closing the distance until he was close enough to notice details that had gone unseen before. The boy was even thinner than he had seemed from afar, the bones of his face too prominent, his ribs surely visible beneath that filthy t-shirt. The hunger wasn't an act. It was real and chronic, etched into his body like a permanent scar. His hands were small but calloused, covered in cuts and scrapes in various stages of healing, hands of someone who worked hard or lived on the streets under brutal conditions. But it was his eyes that struck hardest, eyes that didn't match the rest of him, that carried a depth and intelligence that made no sense in that context. Mauricio found himself looking into those eyes and feeling something he rarely felt: absolute uncertainty. He couldn't decipher Dean, couldn't fit him into any known category, and that made him deeply uncomfortable. "How do you know about my daughter?" The question came out more like an accusation, loaded with all the distrust and anger Mauricio felt. Dean didn't look away, didn't flinch in the slightest. "I know many things I shouldn't know. I know she's slowly losing her movement, that no doctor has been able to explain what's happening, that you've spent a fortune on tests and they all came back normal. I know she's getting worse every day and that you're desperate because you feel like you're running out of time, like she's slipping through your fingers and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Each word was like a precise stab, hitting the most sensitive points exactly, and Mauricio felt the ground sway beneath his feet. How did that boy know those details? How did he know information that was kept under absolute secrecy, that not even the mansion staff fully knew? The rational explanation would be that someone had told him, that there had been an information leak. But something in the way Dean spoke suggested something else, something far more disturbing. The audience of wealthy diners was completely absorbed now, having forgotten their expensive dinners growing cold on their plates. This had stopped being a mere inconvenient interruption and had turned into a fascinating, morbid spectacle. Some began wondering if this wasn't some kind of elaborate artistic performance, one of those strange modern stunts meant to shock the audience. Others whispered theories about how the boy could have obtained that information, ranging from phone tapping to bribed employees. But no one could explain the impossible timing. Mauricio's phone ringing at the exact moment Dean made his promise. Anna's sudden improvement happening at that precise instant. It was too much to be coincidence, yet too impossible to be real. People were trapped between disbelief and a nearly hypnotic fascination, unable to look away from the surreal scene continuing to unfold. Mauricio felt something crack inside him, a fissure opening in the armor of cynicism and rationality he wore to protect himself from the world. He was facing an impossible choice. Either he sent that boy away and spent the rest of his life wondering, what if, or he accepted that absurd proposal and exposed himself to the most humiliating public ridicule of his life. There was no middle ground. There was no way to discreetly test or verify before committing. Either he believed or he didn't. Either he took a blind leap of faith into complete absurdity, or he closed that door and returned to the silent despair that had defined his life for weeks. And the most terrifying part of it all was that, for the first time in a very long time, Mauricio truly didn't know which choice was the right one. The businessman who was always certain, who made million-dollar decisions in seconds, was now completely paralyzed in front of a dirty, hungry street boy promising the impossible. Dean took a small step forward and extended his hand, not to shake, but as if sealing a deal, forming a pact. "Feed me now. Let me eat until I'm full, and I'll go to your house and cure your daughter. I'm not asking for money. I want nothing but food. If I'm lying, you lose nothing but a dinner. But if I'm telling the truth," he left the sentence unfinished, hanging in the air like both a promise and a threat. Mauricio looked at that outstretched hand, dirty with earth and hardened by work or by life on the streets, and saw in it the last piece of driftwood floating in an ocean of despair. It was ridiculous. It was impossible. It was completely insane. But it was also the only new thing that had appeared after weeks of useless consultations and tests that led nowhere. And in that moment, right there in the middle of that five-star restaurant with dozens of judging eyes fixed on him, Mauricio Souza had to make the most difficult decision of his life. Mauricio extended his hand and shook Dean's, feeling the rough texture of calloused skin against his own soft palm, the hand of someone who had never had to do hard labor in his life. The grip was firm, firmer than he expected from such a thin and seemingly fragile boy, and in that touch there was something that felt like it sealed more than a simple agreement about food. It was as if an invisible pact were being forged, something that went far beyond what words had said. The entire dining room erupted in shocked murmurs. Some guests were openly laughing now, others shaking their heads in disbelief and pity. A woman dripping with expensive jewelry commented loudly enough to be heard that desperation really makes people completely lose their minds. A group of businessmen at a nearby table were already discreetly taking photos with their phones, certainly to share later in their social circles the unbelievable story of how the powerful Mauricio Souza had fallen for an obvious scam by a street kid. The humiliation was palpable, heavy as lead in the air, and Mauricio felt every judging glance like a needle piercing his skin. Jacques, the maitre d', approached with his face still red but now also confused, completely lost about the proper protocol for such an unprecedented situation. "Mr. Souza, are you sure about this? We can simply remove the boy and you can finish your dinner in peace." His voice carried an almost pleading tone, as if he were begging Mauricio to return to his senses and allow him to restore order and dignity to the establishment. But Mauricio didn't look at Jacques. He kept his eyes fixed on Dean as he replied in a voice that allowed no argument. "Bring him food. Bring the best you have in the kitchen. Bring it in quantity, and keep bringing it until he says he's satisfied." The silence that followed was so deep it was possible to hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clinking of cutlery in the kitchen. Mauricio had just done the unthinkable. He had publicly validated that absurd situation, and there was no turning back now. Dean was guided to Mauricio's table, and the sight of him sitting in that red velvet chair, his dirty body grotesquely contrasting with the surrounding elegance, was almost surreal. His filthy clothes stained the expensive upholstery, his bare feet didn't quite reach the floor, and when he placed his hands on the table, he left small smudges of dirt on the immaculate white linen cloth. Mauricio sat across from him, watching with a mix of morbid fascination and something close to desperate hope. The waiters began bringing dishes, and the barely concealed horror on their faces was almost comical. They were used to serving the elite, people who knew exactly which fork to use for each course, who discussed tasting notes and complex pairings. Serving a street boy who had probably never seen half of those ingredients in his life completely shattered the restaurant's norms. The first dish to arrive was a filet mignon in red wine sauce with truffle mashed potatoes and grilled asparagus, a culinary masterpiece that cost the equivalent of a week's rent in a modest apartment. Dean looked at it as if he were staring at a treasure, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. He didn't wait for any etiquette instructions. He simply grabbed the knife and fork awkwardly, clearly unaccustomed to silver cutlery, and began eating with a voracity that was both moving and unsettling. These weren't polite, delicate bites like those at the other tables. This was real hunger being satisfied. Large mouthfuls chewed quickly, as if he feared someone might take the plate away at any moment. Sauce dripped from the corner of his mouth, but Dean didn't care, completely absorbed in the experience of finally eating something substantial. Mauricio watched with a strange feeling in his chest, a mix of discomfort and something bordering on compassion. More dishes kept arriving because Dean ate everything at the same astonishing speed. There was shrimp risotto with saffron, then grilled salmon with an herb crust, followed by lamb loin with honey and rosemary reduction. Each plate was an artistic production the chefs had spent years perfecting, and Dean devoured it all without ceremony, without pauses to savor complex flavors or refine textures. It was pure fuel, food being processed by a body that had been in deprivation mode for far too long. The other diners could no longer pretend they weren't watching. Many had abandoned their own meals and were now observing the bizarre spectacle with morbid fascination. Some took photos, others discreetly filmed, and it was easy to imagine the headlines circulating through elite social circles the next day. Mauricio Souza, the billionaire businessman, feeding a street boy at the most expensive restaurant in the city in exchange for an absurd promise of miraculous healing. But then something unexpected happened that made Mauricio truly pay attention. When the fifth dish arrived, a fresh pasta with porcini mushrooms and shaved aged parmesan, Dean suddenly stopped eating mid-meal and looked at Mauricio with disarming seriousness. "I want half of this wrap to go." The sentence caught Mauricio completely off guard. A real con artist would have eaten everything, would have taken full advantage of that unique opportunity to gorge on expensive food without paying a cent. But Dean was voluntarily giving up part of the meal, asking to save it, as if he had a specific purpose for that food beyond satisfying his own hunger. Mauricio leaned forward, genuinely curious for the first time. "What? Are you afraid you won't eat again? You can eat it all now. I won't deny you food." Dean shook his head, and there was a strange dignity in the way he did it, a firmness that didn't fit the situation. "It's not for me. There are other people who are hungry too. Children younger than me, an old man who can't work anymore, a pregnant woman who was thrown out of her home. If I eat everything knowing they're starving, what does that make me?" The answer hit Mauricio like a punch to the gut. That wasn't the behavior of a con artist. It wasn't the attitude of someone trying to deceive or manipulate. It was something far more unsettling. It was genuine concern for others, a sense of responsibility and community coming from someone who had every reason in the world to be selfish and think only of himself. Mauricio had known hundreds of wealthy people throughout his life, people who had everything and still clutched every dollar with white-knuckled greed, who stepped on others to climb one more rung on the social ladder. And here was a boy who had nothing, absolutely nothing, and still thought about sharing what little he got with others who were suffering too. It was humbling, in a way, a mirror reflecting an uncomfortable truth about priorities and values. Jacques ordered half of each remaining dish wrapped up, and soon there was a substantial bag of expensive food prepared to go. Dean accepted it with a simple but genuine thank you, carefully placing the bag on the floor beside him as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Mauricio noticed that the other diners had seen that moment too, and some of the mocking looks had shifted into something closer to confusion or even reluctant respect. It was hard to maintain cynicism in the face of such pure and unexpected altruism. The narrative everyone had built in their minds of a clever kid pulling a scam was starting to crack because scammers don't do things like that. Scammers take everything they can and disappear. They don't stop midway to think about others. Something didn't add up. Something about that entire story was off script, and it made people question their initial judgments. When Dean finally finished eating, he leaned back in the chair with a long, deep sigh, the first expression of true relief to cross his face since he had entered the restaurant. He had eaten enough for probably 3 normal meals, but he didn't look stuffed or sick, just satisfied in a basic, fundamental way. Mauricio watched and felt something shift inside him, a subtle change in how he saw the boy. He was no longer just the street kid making an absurd proposal. He had become something more complex, more human, more real. And with that shift came a rise in anxiety, because now Mauricio truly didn't know what to expect. The rational part of his brain still screamed that this was madness, that there was no chance a street boy could do what specialist doctors hadn't. But a smaller, more desperate part whispered, "What if?" Dean stood up, grabbed the bag of food with one hand, and looked at Mauricio with those intense eyes that seemed to see straight through his defenses. "It's time to go to your house. It's time for me to keep my part of the deal." His voice was calm, confident, without a trace of nervousness or doubt. Mauricio stood up as well, his legs feeling slightly weak, his head spinning with the enormity of what was about to happen. He was going to take that boy to his mansion, bring him into the same space as Anna, give him access to the most precious person in his life based on nothing more than an absurd promise made in a restaurant. It was the most insane thing Mauricio had ever done, and he knew there would be no hiding it, no controlling the narrative afterward. By tomorrow everyone would know. Newspapers would publish it. Social media would explode. His reputation as a serious, rational businessman would be torn apart. But looking at Dean, seeing that unshakable certainty, Mauricio realized he simply didn't care anymore. They left the restaurant together, the billionaire in an Italian suit and the barefoot street boy, under the stunned stares of everyone present. Mauricio's armored Mercedes was waiting at the entrance, and when the driver saw Dean, the look of shock on his face was almost comical. But Mauricio gave no explanations. He simply got into the car and gestured for Dean to get in as well. The contrast was striking, the genuine leather interior and fine wood trim now shared with a boy who left dirt marks wherever he touched. As the car glided smoothly through the city streets toward the mansion, Mauricio looked out the tinted window and wondered whether he had just done the only right thing possible or had completely lost his mind. The answer would come soon, and one way or another, nothing would ever be the same after that night. Because sometimes the most important choices in life are the ones that force us to swallow our pride, ignore logic, and take a leap of faith into the impossible, even knowing we might be diving straight into absolute ridicule. The car glided through the gates of the Souza mansion, that immense property that looked more like a European palace transplanted into Brazil, with its elaborate gardens, ornamental fountains, and a main building with more rooms than Mauricio could count off the top of his head. Dean looked out the window with an expression that was neither admiration nor envy, but something closer to recognition, as if he already knew exactly what awaited him inside. The driver opened the door and they both stepped out, Mauricio walking with quick, determined strides while Dean followed at a calmer pace, the bag of food still hanging from his hand. The property's security guards stared at the scene in total confusion, wanting to ask questions but not daring to challenge the boss's decisions. The tension was palpable even there, in the night air that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mauricio offered no explanations to anyone. He simply entered through the front door and gestured for Dean to follow, climbing the marble stairs toward the second floor where Anna's bedroom was located. Raquel, the nurse, was standing in the hallway when they arrived, and the look on her face shifted from absolute shock to furious indignation. She was a woman in her early 40s, professional to the core, with decades of experience in complex cases and an impeccable reputation in the medical field. Seeing Mauricio arrive with a dirty, barefoot street boy, clearly bringing him close to Anna, was more than she could process. "Mr. Souza, what are you doing? This boy cannot come in here. Anna is immunocompromised. Any infection could be fatal in her condition." Her voice came out shrill, broken by disbelief and professional fear that something terrible was about to happen. Mauricio stopped and looked at her with an expression that mixed exhaustion and determination. "Raquel, you've worked for me for 7 years and you trust me, right? Then trust me now. This boy is going to see Anna and you will not interfere. That's an order." The tone allowed no argument, but Raquel's eyes were wide with panic and disbelief. Dean didn't wait for more drama. He simply walked past Raquel and entered Anna's room as if he knew exactly where he was going. Mauricio followed, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. The room was enormous, decorated in soft pastel tones, with a princess-style bed surrounded by medical equipment that looked completely out of place in an environment meant for childhood dreams. Anna lay there, so small in that big bed, her body far too thin beneath a light comforter. When she saw Dean enter, her eyes widened in surprise and something else, something Mauricio couldn't identify but that looked almost like recognition. Dean approached the bed slowly, placed the bag of food on the floor, and looked at Anna with an intensity that made the girl stop breathing for a second. "Hi Anna. I came to help you." His voice was gentle but carried that same impossible certainty, and Anna showed no fear at all, which was strange considering a dirty stranger had just entered her room. Dean asked Mauricio to help him sit Anna more upright on the bed and began what could only be described as a completely unconventional examination. He didn't use a stethoscope, didn't check blood pressure, didn't perform any standard medical procedures. Instead, he observed Anna in an almost meditative way, his eyes scanning every inch of her as if reading something invisible written on her skin. He gently took her hands and examined her palms and fingers, paying special attention to her nails and the small lines in her skin. He asked her to open her mouth and looked inside with intense concentration, not at her throat like doctors do, but at her tongue, her gums, even the specific coloration inside her cheeks. Then he asked to look closely at her eyes, carefully holding her small face as he studied her iris, the sclera, even the way her eyelids moved. Every gesture was deliberate, filled with purpose, and Mauricio watched it all with a mix of fascination and growing skepticism. "Do you feel more tired after eating certain foods?" Dean suddenly asked, still holding Anna's face while looking deeply into her eyes. The girl thought for a moment and nodded slowly. "Rice? Sometimes after I eat rice I get really tired, like a strange dizziness." Dean nodded as if that information confirmed something he already suspected. He released her face and began gently palpating her neck, his fingers searching for something specific, and when he found a particular spot, Anna let out a small groan of discomfort. "Does it hurt here?" She confirmed that it did, and Dean continued the examination, moving down to her shoulders, her arms, pressing specific points along the way and observing her reactions. It didn't seem random. There was a clear methodology behind it, as if he were following an invisible map drawn on her body. Raquel, who had entered the room behind them and was watching everything with crossed arms and the look of someone witnessing a crime, could no longer stay silent. "This is absurd. You're hurting her. Mr. Souza, for God's sake, put an end to this." But Mauricio raised his hand, signaling for silence, his eyes fixed on Dean and what he was doing. Because despite how strange it looked, despite not following any medical protocol, there was something methodical about the examination, something that suggested real knowledge, even if it wasn't the kind taught in universities. Dean continued, checking Anna's legs, observing how her muscles did or didn't respond to stimuli, paying attention to skin temperature in different areas, even smelling near certain points as if he could detect something by scent. When he finally finished, he stepped back slightly and stood there with his eyes closed, clearly processing all the information he had gathered. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitors and the tense breathing of 4 people waiting for some revelation. Mauricio realized he was holding his own breath, his hands sweaty, his entire body tense like a violin string about to snap. Dean opened his eyes and looked directly at Mauricio, his expression far too serious for someone so young. "Can I speak in front of her, or would you prefer we talk in private?" The question caught Mauricio off guard, but Anna answered before he could. "I want to hear it. It's about me. I have the right to know." Her voice was weak but determined, and Mauricio nodded, recognizing that his daughter was right. Dean took a deep breath as if preparing to share something heavy. What she has isn't a disease in the traditional sense. It's not genetic, it's not autoimmune, it's not neurological in the way doctors understand it. It's slow intoxication, progressive poisoning that's attacking her nervous system little by little. The words fell like bombs in the middle of the room and Raquel laughed in disbelief. "Poisoning? We ran every toxicology test possible. Everything came back negative. You're making this up." But Dean didn't look at her. He kept his focus on Mauricio. "You were looking for the wrong poisons. You looked for common heavy metals, industrial chemicals, known substances. But there are things in nature that don't show up in those standard tests, plants that can cause exactly these symptoms." Mauricio felt the blood freeze in his veins. "How do you know this? How can you say this with such certainty?" Dean finally looked away, focusing on some distant point as he spoke, and his voice took on a tone of memory mixed with sadness. "My grandmother was a healer, one of the last who still preserved ancestral knowledge about medicinal and poisonous plants. She raised me after my parents died, taught me everything she knew from the time I was very small. She showed me how to read bodies, how to identify symptoms modern medicine doesn't recognize, how each plant has a specific signature that leaves marks on the body." He paused, his eyes growing a little moist. "She died 3 years ago, left me alone, but before that she spent years training me. She said knowledge couldn't die with her, that someone needed to keep knowing these things because one day they would matter. I thought it was just old woman talk, you know? But after she was gone, I started seeing cases, people on the streets who were sick in ways hospitals couldn't explain, and I could see what was wrong." The story sounded absurd, almost too fantastical to be true, but the emotion in Dean's voice was genuine and impossible to fake. Mauricio saw tears forming in the corners of those large eyes, saw the raw vulnerability of someone speaking about a deep loss. Raquel still looked skeptical, but even she had grown quieter, clearly affected by the boy's evident sincerity. Anna, lying in bed, watched Dean with an expression of pure empathy, and her words came weak but clear. "I lost my mother too. I know how much it hurts to be alone." Dean looked at her and smiled for the first time since entering the mansion, a sad but genuine smile that completely transformed his face. For a moment, Mauricio saw not just a street boy making impossible promises, but a child who had suffered deeply and still retained the capacity to feel compassion for others. It was humanizing in a deeply unsettling way, shattering all the simple categories Mauricio had tried to use to understand the situation. "So what do we do now?" Mauricio asked, and for the first time in weeks he felt something like real hope, not the desperate hope of before but something more solid, based not on empty promises but on specific knowledge, however unconventional it might be. Dean thought for a moment, his eyes returning to that focused intensity. First I need to confirm my suspicions. I need to see what she eats regularly, where the food comes from, who prepares it, where the ingredients are stored. If I'm right about the type of poison, there will be a source somewhere in this house. And when I find that source, I can prepare an antidote. My grandmother taught me neutralizers for most plant-based poisons. Raquel exploded again. This is madness. A homemade antidote? You're going to kill this girl? Mr. Souza, I beg you to reconsider this before it's too late. But Mauricio looked at Ana and saw hope beginning to form in his daughter's eyes, that first spark of something beyond resignation and fear he had seen there in months. Dean stood up, picked up the bag of food he had left on the floor and looked at Ana again. I'm going to find what's poisoning you. And I'm going to cure you, I promise. But it may take a few days, so I need you to hold on, okay? Don't give up. Ana nodded, and there was a new determination on her small, pale face. Dean turned to Mauricio. I need to leave now. I have to deliver this food to the people who are waiting, and I need a few hours to think about everything I observed. But I'll be back tomorrow morning early, and then we'll start the real investigation. Is that okay? Mauricio felt something strange in his chest, a sensation of anticipated loss mixed with panic. And if you don't come back? What if this is all an elaborate story and you just disappear? Dean stared at him with those immense, intense eyes. I'll come back. I don't make promises I can't keep, especially not to sick children. If I say I'll be back, I'll be back. And there was such absolute certainty in that statement that Mauricio found himself believing it, against all logic, against all common sense. They went down together, Mauricio walking Dean to the property gates. The boy walked off down the dark street, the bag of food swinging in his hand, his bare feet making a soft sound against the asphalt. Mauricio stood there watching him walk away until he disappeared completely into the darkness of the night, and only then did he return inside the mansion. Raquel was waiting for him in the living room, arms crossed, her expression a mix of concern and anger. I hope you know what you're doing, because you've just placed Anna's life entirely in the hands of a street boy who talks about grandmother's knowledge and mystical poisons. If she dies because of this? But Mauricio interrupted her with a weary gesture. If she dies, Raquel, it will be because modern medicine had already given up on her anyway. At least now we have a chance, however unlikely it may be. And with those words, he went up to the room next to Anna's, lay down on the bed without even changing his clothes, and stayed awake all night wondering whether Dean would really come back or whether he had just lost the last and most improbable hope he had left. Dawn brought a weak, gray light filtering through the mansion's windows, and Mauricio hadn't slept a single minute. He had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the previous night in his mind, questioning every decision, wondering whether he had made the greatest mistake of his life or finally found a real way out. When the clock struck 6 in the morning, he got up and went straight to Anna's room, finding the girl still asleep with an expression more peaceful than he had seen in weeks. Raquel was there too, sitting in the duty chair, and her red eyes revealed that she had also spent the night awake, watching, waiting for something terrible to happen after the visit of that strange boy. Mauricio approached the bed, watched Anna's breathing rise and fall in a steady rhythm, and felt a stab of something like relief mixed with growing anxiety. Dean had promised to return early in the morning, but what did that mean exactly? 7 a.m.? 10. And what if he simply never came back? The hours began to pass with a torturous slowness that made every minute feel like an eternity. Mauricio remained planted in the living room, from where he could see the property gates through the huge windows, waiting, watching every movement on the street. 8 a.m. turned into 9, 9 into 10, and there was no sign of Dean. The anxiety, already intense, began to turn into something closer to panic mixed with anger. He had been fooled after all. That boy had managed to get a lavish meal, had taken half of it to go, had spun that whole elaborate story about healer grandmothers and mysterious poisons, and now had simply vanished. Mauricio felt like a complete idiot, and the worst part was knowing that probably half the city was already talking about the episode at the restaurant, about how the powerful businessman had fallen for such an obvious scam. His phone rang nonstop with calls from worried partners, curious acquaintances, journalists wanting to confirm rumors, but he ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the gates, waiting for someone who clearly wasn't going to appear. Noon came and went, and Mauricio felt something break inside him. It wasn't just disappointment, it was something deeper, more painful. It was the last shred of hope being ripped away in a cruel and definitive way. He went up to Anna's room and found the girl awake, those big eyes looking at him with a silent question she didn't need to voice. He didn't come, my love. I'm so sorry. I think he tricked us. His voice came out broken, heavy with crushing guilt for having given his daughter hope only to take it away again. But Anna shook her head with surprising stubbornness. "He's coming, Dad. I know he's coming," he promised. The child's blind faith was both beautiful and painful to witness, because Mauricio knew the world didn't work that way, that promises were broken all the time, especially by desperate people who would do anything for a plate of food. Raquel entered the room at that moment, and the expression on her face was one of bitter, sad satisfaction. "I warned you, Mr. Souza. I warned you this would happen." There was no triumph in her voice, only genuine sadness at being right about something so terrible. The first day without Dean passed in a fog of disappointment and self-reproach. Mauricio locked himself in his office, ignoring calls and meetings, just sitting there brooding over how he had been so foolish. When night fell, he returned to Anna's room and sat beside her, holding the small, cold hand that seemed to be growing weaker by the hour. The girl didn't speak much, but her eyes still carried that stubborn hope that refused to die even in the face of obvious abandonment. Mauricio couldn't understand where that faith came from, that unshakable certainty that Dean would return. Maybe it was just childhood innocence, an inability to accept that people can be cruel and selfish. Or maybe it was something else, some connection he didn't understand, some perception Anna had and he didn't. Either way, seeing that hope in his daughter's eyes while his own heart sank into despair was one of the most painful experiences Mauricio had ever endured. He wanted to protect her from disappointment, wanted somehow to make Dean appear just so he wouldn't have to watch that faith shatter. The second day was even worse because it brought a visible deterioration in Anna's condition. She woke up struggling to breathe, her skin paler than usual, and when she tried to move her left arm, she discovered it no longer responded to her brain's commands. The paralysis had advanced overnight, claiming another piece of her, and the terror that appeared in the girl's eyes when she realized this was like a knife being driven into Mauricio's heart. Raquel called the doctors immediately, and soon the room was filled with professionals running tests, checking vitals, whispering to each other with that professional concern that barely concealed panic. "The progression has accelerated," one of them murmured to Mauricio in a corner of the room. "If it continues at this pace, she may have a week at most 2. The words were death sentences disguised as a medical prognosis, and Mauricio had to brace himself against the wall to avoid collapsing right there. 1 week. His daughter had 1 week to live, and he had wasted precious days waiting for a street boy who was never coming back. Anna grew more agitated as the day went on, not because of the paralysis but because of Dean. She asked about him constantly, wanted to know if he had sent a message, if he had called, if he had shown up at the gates and not been let in. Each question was torture for Mauricio, who had to invent hollow excuses about maybe Dean being busy, maybe having some problem, maybe showing up tomorrow. But the lies sounded weak and unconvincing even to him, and Anna wasn't foolish despite her age. She saw through them, saw the defeat in her father's eyes, but refused to accept it. One afternoon she had a violent emotional outburst, screaming that she wanted to see Dean, that he had promised that he wouldn't abandon her. Raquel tried to calm her, explaining that sometimes people don't keep promises, that she needed to accept reality. But Anna didn't want to hear it, shaking her head back and forth, crying with a desperate intensity that broke anyone who witnessed it. "He's coming," he promised. "You don't understand, he's not like other people." Raquel lost her patience during one of those crises. She grabbed Anna by the shoulders, not forcefully but firmly, and spoke in a harsh tone she rarely used. "Anna, listen. That boy was a scammer. He used you, used your father, got free food and disappeared. That's what desperate people do. They lie, manipulate, make empty promises. You need to stop believing in this fantasy and accept that he's not coming back." The words were cruel but came from a place of genuine concern, an attempt to spare Anna from an even greater disappointment. But the effect was the opposite. Anna began screaming that Raquel was lying, that she didn't know anything, that Dean was different and everyone else was too blind to see it. The situation escalated so quickly that Mauricio had to intervene, practically dragging Raquel out of the room while Anna continued sobbing on the bed. It was an ugly, painful moment that left everyone emotionally drained, and when the door finally closed with Raquel outside, Mauricio sat on the bed beside his daughter and hugged that small, trembling body, feeling tears soak his shirt as he wondered how things had reached that point. The third day dawned with a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate the entire mansion. Mauricio woke after only a few hours of restless sleep and went straight to Anna's room, and what he found there made him freeze in the doorway. The girl lay completely motionless, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible, and for the first time he truly faced the very real possibility that she might not wake up one of these mornings. The monitors showed vital signs still within acceptable limits, but there was a different quality to that stillness, something beyond physical paralysis. It was as if Anna were giving up, as if disappointment and the loss of hope were draining the will to fight that had kept her holding on until then. Raquel stood beside the bed, and when her eyes met Mauricio's, she didn't need to say anything. The message was clear in her gaze. There wasn't much time left. Mauricio approached, took Anna's hand, and whispered her name several times until her eyes finally opened, empty and distant in a way that terrified him completely. It was in that moment of absolute darkness, when the last drop of hope seemed to have finally dried up, that something extraordinary happened. The intercom at the gate rang, that mechanical, impersonal sound that normally meant nothing important. The guard at the gate called the house, his voice coming through the built-in sound system. "Mr. Souza, there's a boy here at the gates. A boy, barefoot and dirty. He says you're expecting him. He says his name is Dean." The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Mauricio stood completely frozen for a few seconds, unable to process what he had just heard. Raquel stared at him wide-eyed in shock. And Anna, the girl who had seemed to be giving up only moments earlier, suddenly moved with a strength she shouldn't have had, turning her head toward the intercom, her eyes lighting up with renewed life. "I told you," she whispered, and there was fierce triumph in that weak voice. "I told you he'd come back." Mauricio ran out of the room, rushed down the stairs so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet, and shouted for the guard to let Dean in immediately. He went to the front door and flung it open, stepping onto the veranda, his eyes scanning the wide driveway that led to the gates. And there he was, walking slowly but with a determined stride, an old backpack slung over his shoulders, bare feet leaving prints on the perfect stone path. Dean looked even thinner and more exhausted than before, as if the 3 days had been brutal on him, but there was something different in his posture, a new determination visible in every step. When he finally came close enough for Mauricio to see his face clearly, he noticed the deep dark circles under Dean's eyes, as if he hadn't slept properly, and fresh scratches on his arms and legs. But the most important thing was what he carried. The backpack was full of something, with plants hanging from the outside, leaves and roots tied with twine in an improvised but careful way. "Sorry for the delay," Dean said when he finally stood face to face with Mauricio, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I needed to get some specific things and it wasn't easy to find everything I needed. But now I'm ready. Now we can really begin." And there was so much conviction in those simple words that Mauricio felt something collapse inside him, all the defenses, all the anger, all the disappointment of the last 3 days simply evaporating in the face of that impossible presence. Dean had come back. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything Mauricio had learned about human nature and reliability, the boy had returned exactly as promised. And somehow, that simple act of keeping a promise when no one expected it changed everything completely. Because now it was no longer about giving a chance to a stranger. It was about trusting someone who had already proven himself trustworthy in the most basic and fundamental way possible. Dean entered the mansion carrying that old backpack as if it were a chest of priceless treasures, and Mauricio noticed his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from pure exhaustion. The boy looked as though he had aged years in just 3 days, his eyes sunken and his clothes even more torn than before, stained with fresh dirt and what looked like dried blood in some places. Mauricio wanted to ask 1,000 questions about where he had been, what had happened, why it had taken so long, but something in Dean's posture made it clear there was no time for explanations now. He went straight up the stairs toward Anna's room without even asking for directions, as if some invisible instinct were guiding him, and Mauricio followed closely, his heart pounding in a frantic rhythm that mixed renewed hope with fear of another disappointment. When they entered the room, Anna was sitting up in bed, propped by pillows, and the smile that lit up her pale face when she saw Dean was so pure and genuine that Mauricio felt his eyes burn with tears he refused to let fall. Raquel was standing in the corner of the room, and the expression on her face shifted from surprise to something far darker when Dean walked in. She rose from the chair with her arms crossed, that defensive posture of someone about to enter a battle. "So you finally decided to show up. 3 days, boy. 3 days while she kept getting worse, clinging to a hope I was sure you were going to destroy. I hope you have a very good explanation for that." Her voice was cold as ice, loaded with all the anger accumulated during those days of vigilance and despair. Dean looked directly at her, without flinching or shrinking back, and there was a strange dignity in the way he held that accusing gaze. "I had to go look for specific plants that only grow in specific places. It's not like going to a pharmacy and buying ready-made medicine. It's about finding things most people don't even know exist. It took time because I wanted to do it right, not because I abandoned anyone. The answer was simple but carried an unshakable truth, and Raquel frowned, clearly unsatisfied but without any immediate argument to counter it. Dean took the backpack off his shoulders and began emptying its contents onto the nightstand beside Anna's bed, and what came out was a bizarre collection of plants Mauricio had never seen in his life. There were twisted roots that looked like abstract sculptures, leaves of strange shapes and shades of green ranging from almost black to nearly yellow, dried flowers that released pungent aromas, and small improvised vials filled with suspiciously colored liquids. Each item was carefully placed on the table, and Dean murmured names under his breath as he organized everything, names that sounded like words from another language or perhaps another time. Jurabiba brava, Erva de bicho, Tsipa mil homens reais de Jurinya. Raquel watched with a mix of horror and growing disbelief, and when Dean finished organizing and began separating specific items, she could no longer hold back. This is madness. You can't give these things to her. We don't even know what they are. They could be poisonous, they could kill her even faster. Mr. Souza, for the love of God, you can't allow this. But before Mauricio could respond, Dean turned to Raquel with an expression that mixed patience and frustration. You're right to be skeptical. It's your job to protect her. But I didn't come here to make things worse, I came to fix them. And before giving Anna anything, I need to confirm what's poisoning her. I need to examine everything she eats, where it comes from, how it's prepared. If you really care about her, you'll help me do that instead of getting in my way. The words were direct but not aggressive, carrying a logic that was hard to argue against. Raquel opened and closed her mouth a few times, clearly torn between her protective instinct and the realization that Dean had a point. Mauricio seized the moment of hesitation to intervene. Raquel, I understand your concerns. But let's do this. Dean will investigate, examine everything, and anything he wants to give Anna, you'll be present. You can question it, you can even ask to have it analyzed if you want. But we won't block this before it even begins. Is that fair? Raquel looked at Mauricio, then at Dean, then at Anna in the bed, and finally sighed with bitter resignation. Fine. But I want it on record that I'm doing this under protest and that I consider this extremely irresponsible. If anything happens to her, Dean interrupted gently. If anything happens to her because of what I do, you can blame me, yell at me, even report me if you want. But if I manage to cure her, I hope you have the humility to admit you were wrong. The challenge was clear but not arrogant, simply a statement of confidence in his own abilities. Raquel didn't respond, only crossed her arms tighter and leaned back against the wall, making it clear she would watch every move but would no longer actively interfere. It was a tense, fragile truce, but it was enough for Dean to begin working. He turned to Mauricio with those intense eyes that seemed to see more than they should. I need to see the kitchen, the pantry, the garden if there are plants, and talk to whoever prepares Anna's meals. The faster we start, the faster I'll find the source. Mauricio took Dean through the mansion on a tour that revealed more about the inner workings of the house than he would normally share with any stranger. They began in the kitchen, a massive, professional space where Dona Celeste, the cook who had worked for the family for over 10 years, was preparing lunch. The woman was visibly shocked when she saw Dean enter her sacred territory, her personal domain, and the look of disapproval on her round, flushed face made it clear what she thought of that dirty boy invading her pristine kitchen. Dean completely ignored the hostility and began asking direct, specific questions. Where the ingredients came from, where they were stored, who had access to them, whether there was any special seasoning used in Anna's meals. Dona Celeste answered reluctantly, clearly offended by the implication that her cooking could be the source of the problem, but Dean persisted with unshakable patience, mentally noting every detail she shared with reluctance. Next came the pantry, a refrigerated room filled with shelves organized with military precision. Dean examined every jar, every package, smelling some, opening others, even tasting small amounts of specific seasonings in a way that made Raquel, who followed them like a vigilant shadow, recoil in disgust. There was a clear methodology to what he was doing, even if it followed no known scientific protocol. He wasn't looking for one specific thing but eliminating possibilities, discarding items one by one according to some internal criteria only he fully understood. When they reached the special seasonings, those small jars of dried and ground herbs, Dean stopped and held one in his hand longer, turning it, opening it, and inhaling deeply. His face tightened into a thoughtful, almost concerned expression. This one. Where did this come from? Dona Celeste stepped closer to see which one it was. Oh, that's a seasoning the gardener Adalto grows in the back garden. He says it's a special herb, kind of a wild oregano that gives a unique flavor. I use it in almost everything for the girl because she likes the taste. Dean looked at Mauricio with an expression that made the businessman's blood run cold. It wasn't triumph, it was something closer to contained horror. I need to see that garden. Now. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and Mauricio felt his stomach knot. They exited through the back door of the mansion, crossed a courtyard paved with Portuguese stone, and reached a less ornamental area where the property's functional gardens were located. Adalto, the gardener, was working there, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and a prominent belly that bounced as he weeded. When he saw the group approaching led by that strange boy, he became visibly uncomfortable, straightening up and wiping his dirty hands on his pants with nervous movements. Dean went straight to the point. I want to see the plants you used to make that special seasoning. Adalto blinked a few times, surprised by the authority in the child's voice. They're just common herbs, nothing special. Here, let me show you. He led them to a specific bed where plants grew that at first glance seemed harmless enough. Dean crouched beside the bed and examined the plants carefully, gently touching the leaves, smelling them, even pulling one out and rubbing it between his fingers to observe the liquid that emerged. Then his expression changed completely, the color draining from his face until it was almost as pale as Anna's. He remained crouched for a few seconds, eyes closed, breathing controlled as if calming himself or preparing for something difficult. When he finally stood and looked at Mauricio, there was contained anger in his gaze, a cold fury that didn't match his age. This isn't wild oregano. This is forgetfulness herb, a plant that grows in dense forest areas and is known to cause exactly the symptoms Anna is showing. Progressive paralysis starting in the extremities and moving upward, loss of motor coordination, extreme fatigue. If ingested regularly in small doses, it does exactly what it's doing to her. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the sound of wind in the surrounding trees. Adalto turned white as a sheet, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Raquel brought a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. And Mauricio felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. You're saying my daughter is being poisoned? On purpose. Mauricio's voice came out low and dangerous, heavy with a rage that was beginning to boil inside him. Dean nodded slowly. This isn't something that happens by accident. That plant doesn't grow naturally in urban gardens. It has to be planted deliberately. And someone who knows enough about plants to cultivate it would also know what it does. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Everyone's eyes turned to Adalto, who began backing away with his hands raised in panic. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Someone gave me the seedlings, said it was a special rare herb that would give the food a unique flavor. I just planted and harvested it. I had no idea it was poisonous. His voice was shrill and desperate, and there was genuine terror in his eyes. Mauricio lunged toward him with clenched fists, and only Dean's hand on his arm prevented something violent from happening right there. Who gave you the seedlings? Who told you to plant this? Adalto was shaking now, tears beginning to stream down his sweaty face. I can't say. She'll kill me. She said if I told anyone. He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that he had already revealed too much. She. Mauricio felt the world spin around him. Who is she, Adalto? Who is poisoning my daughter? The shout echoed through the garden, startling birds from the nearby trees. Adalto completely collapsed, dropping to his knees with sobs shaking his entire body. But before he could answer, Raquel, who had remained strangely silent throughout the revelation, suddenly spoke in a voice that was far too controlled, far too calculated. This is ridiculous. You're really going to believe a street boy who showed up out of nowhere with stories about magical plants and mysterious poisons? Mr. Souza, think clearly. This is obviously an attempt to divert attention, perhaps a more elaborate scam than we initially thought. There was something in the way she spoke that made Dean snap his head toward her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. And Mauricio, in that moment of terrible clarity, realized that Raquel was trying to control the narrative, trying to plant doubt exactly when the truth was about to explode. The war inside the mansion had truly begun, and the battle lines were being drawn in the garden as Adalto cried on the ground and dangerous secrets threatened to finally come to light. Mauricio slowly turned toward Raquel, and something in the way he looked at her made the woman take an involuntary step back. There was a sharp intelligence working behind his eyes, connecting dots that had once seemed isolated but were now beginning to form a terrible and undeniable pattern. Dean was also watching Raquel with that same unsettling intensity, as if he were reading something written in her body language, in the micro-expressions on her face, in the way her hands clenched and unclenched nervously. Interesting, Dean said with a calm that didn't match the tension of the moment. How quick you are to discredit something that could save Anna. A real nurse, a dedicated professional, should be relieved at the possibility of finally having a diagnosis, even an unconventional one. But you're not relieved. You're afraid. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the entire scene. Raquel tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced and artificial. Afraid? That's absurd. I'm trying to protect a child from dangerous quackery. That's my job. But Dean had already turned back to Adalto, who was still kneeling on the ground with his face buried in his hands. Who gave you the seedlings, Adalto? I need you to speak now, because every minute that passes is another minute Anna continues to be poisoned. The gardener sobbed louder, his whole body shaking. She'll destroy me. She'll ruin my life. I have a family, I have children, I can't. Mauricio crouched beside him and grabbed the man's shoulders firmly, forcing him to look him in the eyes. Adalto, you've worked for me for 15 years. You've always been loyal, always honest, and I believe you didn't do this out of malice. But my daughter is dying, and if you don't tell me who's behind this, I'll have to assume you're the only one responsible. Is that what you want? To carry alone the guilt of murdering a child? The rawness of the words hit like a slap to the face. Adalto lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, and opened his mouth to finally reveal the name. But before any sound could come out, Raquel exploded. Enough. Her voice came out in a sharp scream that made everyone turn. She was pale, her hands visibly trembling, and something was breaking in the professional composure she had always maintained. This is a circus. A complete circus. Mr. Souza, are you really going to destroy the life of a loyal employee based on the insane accusations of a street kid? Are you going to throw away years of trust because of plants we don't even know are actually poisonous? This is insanity. But the hysteria in her voice, the way she was losing control, only confirmed the suspicions that were beginning to solidify in Mauricio's mind. Dean took a step toward her, and despite being much smaller and weaker than Raquel, there was something in his presence that made her retreat. You're trying way too hard to divert attention from something. What? What are you hiding? Raquel tried to maintain the facade, but cracks were appearing everywhere. I have nothing to hide. I'm just trying to keep some sanity in this ridiculous situation. Dean turned his back on her, a deliberate move that showed contempt, and focused again on Adalto. You don't need to say the name out loud if you're afraid. Just point. Point to who gave you the seedlings. It was a clever move, cutting around any possibility of verbal denial. Adalto looked around, his eyes passing over Mauricio, then Dean, then stopping on Raquel. His trembling hand slowly rose, his finger pointing directly at the nurse who had cared for Anna for all those months. The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the air. Raquel stood completely still for a few seconds, her face cycling through expressions of shock, then rage, then something like defeated acceptance. Then she began to laugh, a low, bitter sound that grew in volume and intensity until it was almost hysterical. Of course it would be like this. Years of flawless work, years dedicating myself to this family, and in the end I'm betrayed by a cowardly gardener and some kid who showed up out of nowhere. Mauricio slowly stood up, and the expression on his face was that of someone who had just stared into the abyss and seen something he could never unsee. You've been poisoning my daughter this whole time. You, whom I trusted, whom I brought into my home, whom I paid generously to care for her. You were killing her little by little while pretending to try to save her. His voice was controlled, but it carried a rage so intense it was almost physically palpable. Raquel stopped laughing abruptly, and when she looked at Mauricio, there was something different in her eyes, something cold and calculating that had never been visible before. It was as if a mask had fallen, revealing a completely different person underneath. You understand nothing. Nothing about what's happening here. You think it's simple? You think it's just an evil nurse poisoning an innocent child? It's far more complex than that, far deeper. There was an almost theatrical quality to the way she spoke, as if she were finally allowed to be authentic after months of playing a role. Dean approached Raquel cautiously, his eyes studying her every movement. You didn't do this alone. Someone instructed you, taught you about poisonous plants that don't show up on standard toxicology tests. That level of knowledge isn't something a normal nurse would have. Who taught you? The question was precise, striking at something fundamental, and Mauricio saw Raquel hesitate for the first time since the mask had fallen. She looked at Dean with an expression that mixed hatred with something almost like reluctant respect. You're smarter than you look, kid. Smarter than you should be. But even you won't guess this part of the story. Mauricio exploded, his voice coming out as a roar. I don't want guesses. I want answers. Who ordered you to do this? Who is behind this monstrosity? His face was red, the veins in his neck bulging, and he lunged toward Raquel with clearly violent intent. Dean had to physically step between them, his small hands pushing against Mauricio's chest with surprising strength. No. If you hurt her now, we'll never know the full truth. And there's more to this story, I can feel it. This isn't just about Raquel following orders. There are layers we haven't seen yet. Dean turned back to Raquel, a new urgency in his voice. Anna doesn't have much time. If you have any shred of humanity, any conscience at all, you're going to tell us everything right now. Because no matter what happens to you, if Anna dies because of your silence, there will be no forgiveness. Not in this world or any other. The words carried an almost spiritual weight, and Raquel seemed to waver under them. Her eyes filled with tears, she tried to blink away, and for the first time since the truth began to surface, something human returned to her face. I never wanted to kill her. It was never about killing. It was just to make her sick enough, weak enough, so that what needed to happen would happen. The sentence came out fragmented, heavy with a guilt that was finally rising to the surface. Mauricio felt his legs give out and had to brace himself against the garden wall to keep from falling. What needed to happen? What the hell are you talking about? Raquel wiped her tears with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her face. I wasn't the one who planned it. I'm not smart enough for that. I don't have the necessary knowledge about plants to choose exactly the right one that wouldn't show up on tests. Someone approached me months ago, offered me an absurd amount of money, more than I'd earn in 10 years working honestly. All I had to do was administer small doses of the powder they gave me, mixed into Anna's food through the seasoning Adalto grew. It wasn't supposed to kill her, they swore it wasn't supposed to kill her, just make her sick enough. Adalto, still on the ground, sobbed louder. She told me the same thing. Said it was to help the girl somehow, something about alternative medicine. I didn't know it was poison, I swear I didn't. His voice was desperate, begging to be believed in his own innocence. Dean crouched down to be at eye level with Raquel, forcing her to look directly at him. Who hired you? I need the name. Now. Raquel bit her lower lip so hard that blood began to run, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out in a broken whisper that still echoed through the garden like thunder. It was Marta. Marta Souza. Anna's mother. The world stopped spinning. The air became too heavy to breathe. Mauricio felt as if he'd been shot in the chest, the physical pain spreading through his entire body. Marta. His ex-wife. Anna's mother. The woman he had once loved, who had carried Anna in her womb, who had given birth to that child. She was behind everything. She had planned the slow, methodical poisoning of her own daughter. The monstrosity of that revelation was so vast, so incomprehensible, that Mauricio's brain simply refused to fully process it. Dean looked at Mauricio and saw a man completely destroyed, every certainty holding his reality together disintegrating in real time. Why, was all Mauricio managed to say, his voice strangled. Why would she do this to her own daughter? Raquel shook her head, tears now flowing freely. I don't know all the details. She didn't tell me everything. She just said it had to do with inheritance, with control, with proving something. She said that when everything was over, Anna would be fine again, that she had a plan to cure her afterward. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because the money was too much to refuse, because I convinced myself it wasn't so terrible if in the end Anna would be okay. The rationalization was pathetic and transparent, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Dean stood up, the expression on his face older than any child should be. She lied to you. There is no planned cure, no happy ending in this story. Marta was willing to let her daughter die, and you were the tool she used to do it. You were deceived, but that doesn't absolve you because on some level you knew. You knew you were hurting an innocent child. Suddenly Mauricio moved, the paralysis of shock replaced by something primal and furious. He pulled his phone from his pocket with hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it, and dialed Marta's number, still saved in his contacts despite them not having spoken for months. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and finally a female voice answered, the one he knew so well, mixed with irritation at being disturbed. Mauricio? What do you want? I thought we agreed not to. He cut her off with a roar from the depths of his soul. I know what you did. I know you're poisoning Anna. Raquel confessed everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted an eternity before Marta responded, and when she did, her voice had completely changed, all pretense of surprise gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Oh, so you finally figured it out. Took you longer than I expected, honestly. I thought with all your resources you'd have discovered it weeks ago. The casual coldness with which she spoke about poisoning her own daughter was more shocking than any emotional confession could ever have been. Mauricio stood frozen, holding the phone, unable to process the absolute coldness in Marta's voice. She didn't deny it, didn't try to make excuses, didn't show even a hint of remorse or panic. It was as if she were talking about the weather or commenting on some random piece of news, not confessing to having poisoned her own daughter for months. Dean stepped closer and gestured for the phone, and Mauricio, still in shock, simply handed it over without thinking. Dean's voice was calm when he spoke, but it carried a strange authority for someone so young. Marta, you don't know me, but I'm the one saving your daughter from the death you planned for her. I want you to know that everything you did, every instruction you gave, every dose you ordered administered, I'm going to undo. Anna will survive, and when she does, the entire world will know exactly what kind of monster you are. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Marta replied, there was something new in her voice, something that almost sounded like fear. Who are you? How did some random kid manage to discover what extremely expensive doctors couldn't? Dean smiled without any humor. That doesn't matter. What matters is that I know exactly which poison you used, I know how to neutralize it, and I know you specifically chose something that wouldn't show up on conventional tests so no one would suspect anything. But you made a mistake. You underestimated ancestral knowledge, the kind of wisdom that isn't found in medical books but has been passed down from generation to generation by people who know the land and its plants in ways you'll never understand. Marta laughed on the other end of the line, but it was a nervous sound. You're bluffing. There is no antidote for what she has. I researched extensively, consulted with botanical specialists. I specifically chose something irreversible. Dean shook his head even though she couldn't see him. You consulted the wrong specialist. Because for every poison nature creates, it also creates a cure. That's balance. That's how things work. And my grandmother knew both the poisons and the cures. She taught me about both before she died. Mauricio, who had been standing there listening to that surreal conversation, suddenly found his voice again. He violently snatched the phone back from Dean's hand. Marta, why? Why would you do this to Anna? She's your daughter. You carried her inside you. How is it possible to have that much hatred? The answer came fast, dripping with venom more potent than any plant could produce. Anna isn't your biological daughter, Mauricio. She never was. You think I don't know you always suspected? You always had that doubt eating away at you, but you never had the courage to do a paternity test because you were afraid of the answer. Well, now you're going to know the truth. She doesn't have a single drop of your blood. She's the daughter of another man, a man I truly loved, not like the arranged cold marriage we had. The words were calculated to cause maximum pain, and they worked perfectly. Mauricio felt as if a knife had been driven into his heart, the revelation tearing apart pieces of him that were already fragile. Dean watched his reaction and immediately realized he needed to regain control of the situation before Mauricio completely collapsed. Hang up the phone, Dean said firmly, and when Mauricio didn't react, he simply took the device and ended the call, cutting Marta off in the middle of another venomous sentence. Mauricio looked at him with empty eyes, the shock of the revelation having drained all color from his face. She's not my daughter. All this time, everything I did, and she's not even mine. Dean grabbed Mauricio by the shoulders and shook him with surprising strength. Listen. It doesn't matter whether Anna's blood is biologically yours or not. You raised her, you loved her, you're here desperately trying to save her while her biological mother is trying to kill her. Who's the real father here? Blood doesn't define family. Choice does. And you chose her every single day. So stop sinking into this revelation right now because Anna is dying, and you are the only thing standing between her and death. The words were harsh but necessary, a verbal slap that pulled Mauricio back from the spiral of self-destruction. He blinked a few times, took a deep breath, and some determination returned to his eyes. You're right. You're absolutely right. Mauricio straightened his back, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and looked at Dean with gratitude mixed with renewed determination. What do we need to do now? How do we save her? Dean was already moving, heading toward the house with quick steps. First, we need to get Raquel out of here and make sure she no longer has access to Anna. Second, I need to get the poison powder she was using so I can analyze its exact composition and confirm my suspicions. Third, I need to prepare the antidote, and that's going to take all night because the process is delicate and can't be rushed. Mauricio called the security team on the radio, and within minutes Raquel was being escorted off the property, crying and screaming about forgiveness and second chances, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Adalto was also taken away, though with less force, since he was clearly remorseful and had been more of a victim than a conscious participant. When the mansion was finally free of that toxic presence, Dean returned to Anna's room. The girl was sleeping, her breathing weak but steady, and Dean sat on the edge of the bed watching her with a gentle expression that contrasted with the intensity he had shown earlier. Mauricio entered the room and found Dean simply looking at Anna, and for a moment he saw beyond the clever street kid and saw a child who had lost too much, who had grown up too fast, who carried knowledge and responsibility no one so young should have to bear. "Can you really save her?" Mauricio asked, raw vulnerability in his voice. Dean nodded without taking his eyes off Anna. "I can. But first I need the poison. Where did Raquel keep it?" A quick search of the room Raquel used during overnight shifts revealed a small pouch hidden at the bottom of a drawer, and inside it was a glass vial containing a fine greenish powder. Dean picked up the vial with extreme care, as if he were holding nitroglycerin, and brought it under a strong light to examine it. He opened the vial and smelled the contents, his eyes closing as he processed the olfactory information. Then he wet the tip of his little finger, touched a microscopic amount of the powder, and brought it to his tongue before Mauricio could shout for him to stop. "For God's sake, are you crazy? That could kill you." Dean immediately spat, went to the sink in the adjoining bathroom and rinsed his mouth several times with water, then chewed a few leaves he pulled from his backpack. It wasn't enough to cause harm, just enough to confirm. "And I was right. It's concentrated extract of forget-me-not herb mixed with grated Manaka root. The combination is diabolical because each plant alone causes symptoms that can be mistaken for other conditions, but together they create a synergistic effect that specifically attacks the peripheral nervous system. Whoever taught this to Marta knows a lot about poisonous plants." Mauricio felt nausea rising in his throat as he thought about how many times that powder had been mixed into Anna's food without anyone knowing, how many meals had been silent weapons slowly poisoning her. Dean went back to his backpack and began separating the plants he had collected during his 3 days away. There was a thick, twisted root he identified as snake-counter herb, wide velvety leaves of a plant called forest stonebreaker, and dried flowers of something he called maiden's kiss. He explained as he worked, his hands moving with practiced precision. The snake counter neutralizes plant toxins in the nervous system, but it needs to be combined with stonebreaker to cleanse the kidneys and liver of accumulated residue, and maiden's kiss restores communication between nerves and muscles that was damaged by the poison. Separately, each one does part of the job. Together, in the right proportion, they completely undo the effects of the poisoning. He began chopping the plants with a small knife he pulled from his backpack, each movement deliberate and careful. Mauricio watched in fascination, seeing knowledge that was likely thousands of years old being applied in real time to save his daughter. The preparation process took hours. Dean boiled water in a pot he took from the kitchen, added the plants in a specific order, let them boil for exact amounts of time, partially cooled the mixture, added more ingredients and brought it back to a boil. The kitchen filled with strange aromas, some pleasant and others almost unbearable, but Dean didn't seem to care, completely focused on the task. He tasted small amounts at intervals, adjusting proportions, adding pinches of things Mauricio couldn't even identify. It was part science, part art, part something that almost seemed magical in the way Dean simply knew what to do without measuring anything, trusting instinct and knowledge passed down orally through generations. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Dean finally finished. He had a cup filled with a dark liquid that smelled like wet earth and something vaguely floral. "It's ready," Dean announced, exhaustion in his voice but also satisfaction. Mauricio looked at that dark, strange liquid and felt fear and hope in equal measure. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure this won't hurt her even more?" Dean looked him in the eyes, and there was an ancient seriousness in that young gaze. "Nothing in life is absolutely certain. But I'd bet my own life that this will work. My grandmother taught me and she was never wrong about plants. Never." Mauricio nodded, took the cup with hands that trembled slightly, and the two of them went up to Anna's room. The girl was awake now, her big eyes watching as they entered. Dean approached the bed and smiled at her, that genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Remember I promised I'd heal you? Well, now it's time. This isn't going to taste good, but it's going to make you better. Do you trust me?" Anna looked at the dark liquid, then at Dean, then nodded with a conviction that made Mauricio's heart tighten. Dean helped Anna sit up straighter and held the cup to her lips. "Drink slowly, one sip at a time, and try not to throw up because it needs to stay in your stomach to work." Anna drank obediently, and Mauricio watched the expression of disgust cross her face with each sip, But she kept going, trusting that strange boy in a way that defied rational explanation. When the cup was finally empty, Dean set it aside and gently held Anna's hand. Now you're going to feel strange, maybe warm, maybe tingling where you were numb. That's normal, it's the antidote working, fighting the poison that was in your body. Don't be afraid, I'm going to stay right here the whole time. And he did, sitting on the edge of the bed holding that little girl's hand, while Mauricio watched from the chair beside them, praying to every god he knew and some he didn't that it would work. Because if it didn't, if Dean was wrong, then this last hope would have been the cruelest of all for having seemed so real, so possible, so certain. The first signs that the antidote was working appeared about 30 minutes after Anna finished drinking it. It began with a tingling sensation she described as little electric shocks, running through her arms and legs, exactly where the paralysis had been most intense. Dean nodded with satisfaction when she reported it, explaining that it was the nervous system coming back to life, the connections being restored after months of being blocked by the poison. Mauricio watched with his heart in his throat, torn between hope and the fear that this might only be a temporary reaction before something worse happened. Then Anna moved the toes of her left foot. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was there, real and undeniable. Mauricio couldn't hold back the tears that began to stream down his face, tears of relief so intense they were almost painful. Dean smiled and gently squeezed Anna's hand. It's working. It's going to take a few hours for you to get everything back, but it's working. You're going to be okay, Anna. I promised I would heal you and I'm keeping that promise. The following hours were like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Anna gradually regained movement, first her fingers, then her hands, wrists, arms. Each new achievement was celebrated with tears and smiles, and even Donna Celeste, who had come upstairs to check on the girl, began to cry with emotion when Anna managed to lift her entire arm and wave at her. The coordination was still compromised, the movements slow and shaky, but they were returning. Her body was relearning how to obey the brain's commands. Dean stayed by her side the entire time, monitoring every reaction, sometimes touching specific points on her body and asking questions about what she was feeling, adjusting his understanding of the recovery process as it unfolded. Mauricio couldn't stop staring at that boy who had appeared out of nowhere and was literally saving his daughter's life with knowledge that modern medicine didn't even recognize as valid. It was humbling and wonderful at the same time, a reminder that there were things in the world that money and technology couldn't buy or replicate. When Mauricio's phone rang again showing Marta's number, he hesitated before answering, but Dean made an encouraging gesture. Answer it. Let her know she failed. Mauricio accepted the call and put it on speaker so Dean could hear too. Marta's voice came through calmer now, but there was a calculating quality to it that made Mauricio's skin crawl. Mauricio, we need to talk. In person. There are things you need to know, things far more complicated than that rushed conversation revealed. If you really care about Anna, if you truly want to understand what's going on, you'll come meet me. Mauricio looked at Dean, who was watching the phone with that unsettling intensity. Where? Mauricio asked, and Marta replied with a specific location. The abandoned warehouse in the Riverside district. You know which one. Come alone, midnight. If you bring the police, if you bring security, you'll never know the full truth about who Anna really is and why all this happened. Dean immediately shook his head, whispering to Mauricio. It's an obvious trap. She doesn't want to talk. She wants to do something to you or has some plan for when you get there. But Mauricio felt a burning need to confront Marta in person, to look into the eyes of the woman who had tried to kill her own daughter and demand answers to the questions consuming him from the inside. I'll go, he said into the phone, and Marta replied with barely concealed satisfaction. Great. Midnight. Don't be late. And Mauricio? You're going to want to hear what I have to say. I promise it will completely change how you see everything that happened. She hung up before he could respond, and the silence left in the room was thick and heavy with bad omens. Dean looked at Mauricio with genuine concern. You're really going to meet her? After everything she's done? Mauricio nodded with grim determination. I need answers. I need to understand why she would do something so monstrous. And I need to look her in the eyes when I tell her she failed, that Anna survived despite all her plans. The day passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Anna continued to improve steadily, and by mid-afternoon she was already able to sit up on the bed by herself, her movements still uncoordinated but functional in ways that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Dean prepared more doses of the antidote, explaining that Anna would need to take it regularly over the next few days to ensure all the poison was completely neutralized from her system. Mauricio watched everything with a gratitude beyond words, knowing he owed his daughter's life to a street boy who had every reason in the world to be bitter and selfish, but who instead chose to use his knowledge to help others. As night began to fall, casting long shadows through the corridors of the mansion, Mauricio prepared for the meeting. He dressed in dark clothes, put his fully charged phone in his pocket, and was about to leave when Dean appeared in his doorway. "I'm going with you." It wasn't a request. It was a statement, and there was something in the way Dean said it that didn't allow for argument. "It's too dangerous. You've already done more than enough. You saved Anna, exposed the plan. You don't need to put yourself in more danger," Mauricio tried to argue. But Dean crossed his arms stubbornly. "You don't understand. There's something else going on here, something beyond a crazy mother trying to kill her daughter. Marta mentioned that you'd find out who Anna really is, like there's some bigger secret. And she said something about me having a blood connection to you, remember? I need to be there when the truth comes out because somehow this involves me too." Mauricio frowned, confused. "What do you mean, blood connection? When did Marta say that?" Dean hesitated, and for the first time since Mauricio had met him, he saw real vulnerability in the boy's eyes. "She didn't say it to you. She said it to me in a message Raquel gave me before she was taken away. She said I'm not just some random street kid, that there's a reason I found you, a reason I knew about Anna. She said I'm your nephew, the son of your brother who died years ago." The world stopped spinning again for what felt like the 1,000th time that insane day. Mauricio had had a brother, Leonardo, who had died under mysterious circumstances 15 years earlier, and he had never known Leonardo had left a child behind. The possibility that Dean was family, that the boy who had saved Anna was his own blood, was so unlikely and yet made so much sense in strange ways that Mauricio couldn't fully process it. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Dean looked down at the floor, his bare feet shifting uncomfortably. "Because I wasn't sure it was true. Raquel could have been lying, making something up to manipulate me or cause more chaos. But now, with Marta wanting this meeting, with her saying she's going to reveal truths about who is who, I think she's going to confirm or deny it once and for all. And I need to know. I need to know if I have family beyond the memory of my grandmother." The vulnerability in those words, the longing for belonging that came through, broke something inside Mauricio. He placed a hand on Dean's shoulder, feeling the prominent bones beneath the thin t-shirt. "Then we'll go together. We'll find out the truth, whatever it may be." They left the mansion at 11:30, enough time to reach the warehouse before midnight but not so early as to give Marta a strategic advantage to prepare. The Riverside district was an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of the city, full of empty warehouses and factories that had closed decades earlier. The specific warehouse Marta had mentioned was a place Mauricio knew well. It had once been Souza family property, used to store imported goods before the business shifted focus. Now it was just a rusted metal and cracked concrete structure, a skeleton of better times surrounded by tall weeds and darkness. Mauricio parked the car a few hundred meters away, and the two of them approached on foot, Dean moving with a silent grace that suggested experience in going unnoticed, and Mauricio trying to imitate that caution despite lacking the training. Dim lights were visible through the broken windows of the warehouse, indicating that someone was already inside waiting. When they entered, they found Marta standing in the center of the empty space, illuminated by battery-powered lanterns strategically positioned to cast dramatic shadows on the peeling walls. She looked different from how Mauricio remembered her, thinner, harder, with a sharpness in her eyes that hadn't existed when they were married. Beside her stood a man Mauricio didn't recognize, tall and thin with graying hair and an expression that mixed intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. Marta smiled when she saw them, but it was a cold smile, devoid of any human warmth. "Mauricio. And you brought the kid. Perfect. Saves time having everyone here for the big reveal." Her voice echoed in the empty space, carrying a theatrical quality that made everything feel rehearsed. The man beside her studied Dean with intense interest, his eyes narrowing as if analyzing an intriguing specimen. Mauricio felt Dean tense beside him, that small body preparing to fight or flee if necessary. "You said you were going to tell me the truth," Mauricio said. "So tell it. Why did you try to kill Anna? What the hell do you gain from this?" Marta began walking in slow circles, each step deliberate and calculated. "Gain? Oh Mauricio, you've always been so limited in how you think. Always about financial gain, about business, about numbers and bank accounts. This was never about money." She stopped and looked directly at him. "It was about revenge. Revenge for years of being treated like a trophy, like a pretty doll you paraded at events but never truly loved. Revenge for discovering you had a mistress, that you were planning to leave me and take everything. But most of all, revenge for something you never knew, Anna isn't just the daughter of another man. She is the daughter of your brother Leonardo. The words fell like bombs in the middle of the warehouse, and Mauricio felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Anna was Leonardo's daughter? His biological niece, not his daughter? Marta continued, savoring every second of the psychological torture she was inflicting. Leonardo and I had an affair while you were too busy with your businesses to notice. When I found out I was pregnant, it was already too late to do anything, so I simply let you believe she was yours. And what about Dean? Mauricio's voice came out strangled, barely able to form the words. Marta looked at the boy with an expression that mixed curiosity with something close to contempt. Oh yes, the other bastard of Leonardo. Born to a woman he truly loved, not like me who was just an affair. When Leonardo died, Dean's mother disappeared with the boy and I lost track of them for years. But recently I discovered he was alive, living on the streets after his grandmother died. I wanted to bring him into the equation because I thought it was poetically just, two children of Leonardo, one being poisoned while the other might watch helplessly. The casual cruelty of that statement was breathtaking. Dean took a step forward, his fists clenched. You're lying. My mother never mentioned anything about a father named Leonardo. The man beside Marta finally spoke, his voice deep and polite. Your mother had good reasons to hide that from you, boy. Leonardo Souza was a complex man, involved in dealings that went beyond what was legal. When he died, there were people looking for any trace he left behind, including children. Mauricio looked between Marta and the unknown man, trying to assemble the full puzzle. Who are you? What's your role in all this? The man smiled, and it was a predator's smile. My name is Dr. Valerio Costa. I'm the one who taught Marta about forget-me-not herb and how to use it in a way that wouldn't show up on conventional medical tests. I'm the one who supplied the specific poison, extracted and concentrated for maximum efficiency. And I'm the one who suggested she make Anna sick instead of simply killing her, because a sudden death would raise suspicion, but a mysterious, progressive illness would look like tragic bad luck. He paused, savoring the growing horror on Mauricio's and Dean's faces. You see, I also have my reasons for wanting revenge against the Souza family. Your father destroyed my work decades ago, shut down my laboratory, made me lose years of research into the medicinal properties of native plants. Helping Marta was my way of repaying that old debt. The confession was so casual, so devoid of remorse, that Mauricio felt nausea rise in his throat. You're monsters. Both of you. Using an innocent child as a tool for revenge, poisoning her slowly, making her suffer months of agony. Mauricio took a few steps forward, anger overpowering fear. But Marta raised her hand and Mauricio saw what she was holding. A gun. Small, discreet, but undeniably lethal, pointed directly at him. Don't be dramatic. I didn't plan for Anna to die, not really. She was supposed to get sick enough for you to panic, waste your fortune on useless treatments, and eventually I would return offering a miracle cure that Valerio would develop, making you dependent on me again, putting me back in a position of power. But then that annoying kid showed up and ruined everything. She looked at Dean with genuine hatred. How did you know? How did a street kid manage to identify something the best doctors couldn't? Dean smiled without humor. Because my grandmother was smarter than all of you put together. She taught me that real knowledge comes from the earth, from plants, from the generations that came before. You may have degrees in laboratories, but you don't have wisdom. And that's what saved Anna. Wisdom, not cruel intelligence. Valerio let out a dry laugh. How poetic. But wisdom isn't going to save you two now. You see, we can't let you leave here and tell everything you've heard. That would be very inconvenient for our future plans. He also produced a gun, and Mauricio realized too late that they had walked straight into a trap. This wasn't a meeting for revelations. It was a planned execution. Marta was going to kill him and Dean, eliminate the only two people who knew the full truth, and then return to claim Anna somehow, perhaps by alleging that Mauricio had mysteriously disappeared. Dean quickly scanned the surroundings, evaluating exits, and Mauricio saw the boy's mind working at full speed, searching for a way out. The tension in the warehouse was so thick it felt ready to explode, for people trapped in a moment of imminent violence, everything depending on who would move first. And it was exactly at that moment of maximum tension that bright lights suddenly flooded the warehouse through all the broken windows, and an amplified voice echoed from outside. Police, drop your weapons and put your hands on your heads. Mauricio looked at Dean, confused, and the boy gave a mischievous smile. You really thought I'd let you come here without taking precautions? I called the police before we left, gave them the location, told them the whole story. They were just waiting for the right moment. When the police lights flooded that abandoned warehouse and Marta was handcuffed while still holding the weapon she intended to use to silence Mauricio and Dean forever, something shifted in the air of that cold night. It wasn't just the arrest of a woman who had tried to kill her own daughter. It wasn't only the capture of Dr. Valerio Costa with his poisonous plants and his thirst for old revenge. It was something bigger, deeper. It was the moment when all the carefully constructed lies built over years finally collapsed under the weight of raw, undeniable truth. Mauricio stood there watching Anna's biological mother being taken into a police car, and for the first time in months he felt like he could breathe fully, as if an invisible weight crushing his chest had finally been lifted. Dean stood beside him, that thin, barefoot boy who had saved not just a life but an entire family from total collapse, and when their eyes met, there was a silent understanding between them, a connection that went beyond words or rational explanations. They were family now, not because they had discovered they shared blood, but because they had chosen to stand together when it would have been far easier to walk separate paths. Anna recovered completely in the weeks that followed, each day bringing more strength, more movement, more life back into that small body that had come so close to death. The doctors who examined her afterward were baffled by the miraculous recovery, unable to explain how such advanced paralysis had simply reversed without leaving permanent damage. They asked to examine the antidote Dean had prepared, wanted to analyze it chemically, understand its components, perhaps replicate it for other cases. But Dean politely refused, explaining that the knowledge was not his to share carelessly, that it had been passed down through generations with the condition that it be used with wisdom and respect, never turned into a commodity or commercial product. Mauricio understood and respected that decision, even knowing there could have been a fortune to be made if they chose to exploit that knowledge. Because some things matter more than money. Some things need to remain sacred, protected from the greed that corrupts everything it touches. Anna ran through the mansion's halls again, filling the house with laughter and chaos, and every sound of it was sweeter music than any symphony Mauricio had ever heard in his life. As for Dean, he never returned to the streets. Mauricio insisted that he stay at the mansion, not as an employee or a charity project, but as real family. A room was prepared for him, clothes were bought, but most importantly he was given space to be who he truly was, without pressure to fit into molds that never suited him. Dean kept his knowledge of plants, even creating a medicinal garden at the back of the property where he cultivated the herbs his grandmother had taught him about. Sometimes people came discreetly asking for help with problems conventional medicine couldn't solve. He never charged, following his grandmother's belief that healing knowledge should not have a price, but Mauricio made sure he never lacked anything again, that he had a quality education, that he could grow up with safety and opportunity. More important than anything material, Dean now had what he had always wanted since his grandmother died: belonging, family, a place in the world where he was accepted exactly as he was. Anna and Dean became inseparable, closer than many biological siblings, bound by the shared experience of surviving something that should have destroyed them both. But the story doesn't end with a simple happily ever after where everyone lives in perfect harmony, because real life doesn't work that way, and the scars left by those months of horror don't disappear overnight. Mauricio had to deal with the knowledge that Anna was not biologically his daughter, had to process Marta's betrayal on multiple levels far beyond the poisoning, had to rebuild his sense of identity and family from scratch. There were nights when he woke up drenched in sweat, trembling from nightmares where Anna died in his arms while he watched helplessly. In those moments, it was Dean who appeared at his bedroom door with calming tea made from specific herbs that helped soothe an agitated mind. There were therapy sessions, difficult conversations, moments of anger and sadness that had to be processed and worked through with patience. Anna also had her own demons to face, learning at a very young age that her mother had tried to kill her, that the people we trust can be the most dangerous, that the world is darker and more complicated than any child should ever have to learn. But she had Mauricio and Dean by her side, she had genuine love holding her up through the emotional storms, and that made all the difference. The trial of Marta and Dr. Valerio became a media circus that dominated headlines for months. Gruesome details were exposed publicly, including the affair between Marta and Leonardo, the meticulous way the poisoning was planned and executed, and the twisted motivations that led two seemingly normal people to commit such monstrous acts. Raquel was also tried, though she received a lighter sentence for cooperating with authorities and for being, to some extent, more a manipulated victim than a fully conscious villain. Adalto was cleared of criminal charges after it became clear he truly didn't know he was cultivating poisonous plants, but the guilt he carried was visible in his eyes every time he looked at Anna, a weight no legal acquittal could remove. Mauricio's life changed completely after that experience, his priorities rearranging in ways he never would have imagined. The businesses that once consumed all his time and energy were now delegated to trusted executives while he spent more time at home, more time with Anna and Dean, more time truly living instead of merely existing in the frantic race for more money and more power that had never truly made him happy. And then the question arises that is probably burning in your mind right now. What does all of this mean? Why does this story matter beyond shock value and impossible twists? Maybe it's about understanding that family is not defined by DNA but by choice, by who stays by your side when everything is falling apart and it would be far easier to walk away. Maybe it's about recognizing that knowledge and wisdom come from unexpected places, that a barefoot street boy can have more to teach than university professors with walls full of diplomas. Maybe it's about the nature of evil, about how people who seem normal or even pleasant on the surface can hide unimaginable monstrosities beneath carefully constructed masks. Or maybe it's simply about hope, about how sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources exactly when you had given up believing salvation was possible. Each of you will take something different from this story, connect with different parts of it, carry different lessons, and that's okay because that's how powerful stories work. But now I want to know from you, if you were in Mauricio's place, would you have had the courage to believe Dean when he showed up with that absurd promise? Or would you have sent him away and lost the only real chance to save Anna? Can you imagine the strength it takes to forgive someone like Raquel, who participated in the poisoning even if she was manipulated, or would the hatred be too strong? And most importantly, do you think Marta deserves any kind of compassion for being a victim of her own emotional wounds and thirst for revenge? Or is there a point where someone's actions are simply unforgivable regardless of motivation? Leave your answer in the comments because I truly want to know what you think. I want to understand how this story touched you specifically, what emotions it stirred, what reflections it provoked. And if this story impacted you in any way, if it made you feel something real and deep, then do this. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that subscribe button like your life depends on it, turn on notifications so you don't miss any future videos, and share it with everyone you know who needs to hear stories that go beyond the surface and touch deep truths about human nature. Because we live in a world full of empty content, entertainment that passes through your mind without leaving any mark, stories that are forgotten 5 minutes after they end. But once in a while, something appears that sticks to your soul, that makes you question fundamental beliefs, that stays with you for days or weeks as you think and reprocess it. Those are the stories that are truly worth it, that justify the time invested in watching. So if you made it this far, if you stayed with me through this entire journey from the 5-star restaurant to the abandoned warehouse with guns drawn and truths exploding, then you are exactly the kind of person I create content for. You are someone who values depth, who isn't afraid to explore the dark side of human nature, who understands that the best stories are the ones that challenge us and change us a little in the process of being told. And for people like you, I promise to keep bringing stories that will make you feel, think, question, and maybe even change the way you see the world around you. So stay with me for the next videos because there's much more coming and I guarantee every story will be just as impossible, just as full of twists, just as deeply human as the one you've just heard. Until next time, and remember, sometimes the truth is far stranger and far more terrifying than any fiction could ever be.